Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining Keeping It Simple. Today's guest is Viktor Shvets, global strategist at Macquarie Securities and author of The Great Rupture, which explores the evolution of human society through the rise and fall of empire. I'll drop a link to the book in the chat. Now dial in and relax as we step back and take a look at the bigger picture. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Eric. I appreciate it. Viktor, it's a pleasure to have you join us. For clarifications, Macquarie is the firm that you're with. Now, they're well known for their work in Asia, and that's where you've been based for years. You recently moved to the United States, and you're based out of New York now, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So when you and I last talked, we talked about your book, The Great Rupture, and the dynamics around how the world was going to change very radically going forward. Since our conversation, one of the things that's popped onto the screens is things like AI, which almost fits perfectly with your thesis around the Great Rupture. Maybe you could spend just a few minutes giving us a synopsis of the theory behind the Great Rupture and what possessed you to write this book.
No, absolutely, and thank you for having me. Well, essentially what I try to do is to say there are periods in time which are truly revolutionary, and they really change what we do and how we do things. And I think we are on the cusp of one of those changes. In fact, we've been going through it since early 1980s, but the speed of change is accelerating. And so what I try to do is to look at the factors that drive the change, but also look at how societies are likely to react, how politics is likely to react, and how does it change functioning of the labor markets as well as capital markets. So in other words, the labor market, the role of labor, the role of capital is all will undergo substantial change. And if we have those changes, what does it mean? And if you start thinking what it means, potentially you go in the very, very dark corners. And then you would argue, what sort of policies do we need in order to reduce the degree of disruption that societies and economies are likely to experience over the next couple of decades? So it's starting with the past, looking at the past disruption, but then looking into the future and saying, we're really on the cusp of major changes. What do those changes mean? What do they imply for both policymakers, for people, for capital market professionals? But also, what policies do we need? How do we get from point A to point B without excessive disruption or without really painful changes?
So one of the reasons why I really enjoyed your book, and I really enjoyed the actual thesis that we're facing a revolutionary change, was precisely because you hit on this idea that it happens in episodic fashion, right? In evolutionary terms, it's called punctuated equilibrium, right? Nothing happens, right, and then everything changes.
That's right.
The real dynamic that happened with the Industrial Revolution, and I would encourage people to read any of the papers by Joel Mocher and others. I'm actually going to write my weekend Substack about this, and so I'll put some of the links in there. I encourage people to take a look at this. But the real revolution in the Industrial Revolution was actually to radically expand the quantity of goods that could be purchased, right? Prior to the 18th century, there really was not a lot of difference in terms of the goods that were available in, England in 1750 versus the goods that were available in England in 1050, right? Your underwear would have been made out of homespun, woolen cloth. You would have changed it once a week, much to the joy of those who were close to you who wouldn't have known any better. The idea of decorative clothing or attire simply did not exist. Right. And so one of the critiques that existed about labor prior to the Industrial Revolution was just they didn't work very hard. But the simple reality, and this is what Joel Mocher points out, is that there was nothing for them to buy, right, other than perhaps beer. Right. So if you're limited in your purchase basket, why would you buy something new? Now, the Industrial Revolution led to a flourishing of products. We obviously saw the spice trade and those things emerge as well. The demand for novelties suddenly created the demand for goods and products that you could offer to your wonderful lady friends to attract them to your home so that you were actually able to live a different and interesting life. When we look at this time period and we look at one of the characteristics that's underway, it's that young men increasingly are choosing to stay with their families, not get married, the age of marriage is being delayed, etc. In your mind, is this a similar phenomenon? Are we seeing effectively a younger generation saying, what's the point? Why would I bother to participate given these dynamics?
Yeah, essentially, what you're seeing is a disintermediation of a labor market. What you correctly, Michael, highlighted, we've gone from basically having very broad skills prior to Industrial Revolution to having very, very specific skills. And those skills have to be fine-tuned over your time and the time of your country, gradually getting better and better and more productive. And essentially, humans were the brain of the machines. And as a machine evolved, the brain needed to evolve at the same time. Now, that's what was driving educational standards. That was driving elimination of illiteracy. Then there was a secondary education, college education, and everything had to be more and more specialized compared to what it would have been in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. What started to happen from, we can debate whether it's late 70s or late 80s, what started to happen is that the need for specialist skills started to deteriorate, and the need for much broader skills started to increase. Gradually, the professions started to disappear, or professions started to change beyond recognition. I mean, it's all started with the vice presidents and anybody who was feeding information to CEOs back in 1980s, early 90s. You had a whole army of people who needed to do that, because it could take CEO a week or two just to understand what is happening with his companies. And then suddenly revolution started all around PC. And the CEO could get all the information he needs by mid-1990s within a day, by late 1990s, almost in a split second. So the whole army of people who were enforcing the edicts or conveying information was no longer needed. And then, of course, it progressed into civilian usage. In other words, this was the broadband started to appear. So suddenly the performers realized that, hey, you know what? People just need to buy one song they like. They don't need to buy the entire album. They don't need to buy the entire CD. So there was a massive disruption occurring in entertainment industry. The same started to happen in anything to do with digits. We used to have hundreds of traders when I was based in New York with Deutsche Bank on the New York Stock Exchange. So now we don't have that. Well, certainly Deutsche Bank doesn't have it, but most other people don't. So anybody that deals with the digit of information found their jobs changing beyond recognition. And it goes on. The same applies, as I said, to journalists. The same applies to traders, anybody who deals with any news flow. The same applies to middle management. And that sort of a disruption started to change professions, to change the lines of progression that you would expect. Now, the next stage is not just manipulating digits, but manipulating physical matter, manipulating atoms. That is anything from robotics and automation to alternative energy platforms, alternative transport platforms, fusion of infotech and biotech. Now, that's starting to widen the field even more. So gradually, it started impacting, drivers and plumbers. Manufacturing plants within the next 5-10 years will start disappearing. Supply and value chains will become much more narrow than what they are today. In fact, globalization is dying a natural death. Technology basically is killing it. The only thing what's occurring is that the social tensions and geopolitical tension are accelerating this process. But globalization as an arbitrage on the cost side, an arbitrage of opportunities and efficiency is dying away. A new globalization will appear in the next 10 years, 15 years, but it's not going to be based on a cost arbitrage. So you can see one profession after another is starting to experience declining marginal utility. So in other words, more and more tasks are taken away from you. And when you reach a critical stage, and there are articles by Darren Asimoglu and other guys, who basically tries to compute at what stage, when your tasks are taken away, that your wages and your pricing power starts to diminish. In other words, not only you're not as happy with your life because you're not doing as well or as much as you expected, But on top of that, your marginal pricing power starts to decline. And that's what the book was discussing, that it's not about average changes, it's about marginal that matters. And what the new generation, certainly anybody born after sort of 1980 experiencing, is this feeling of the erosion of marginal utility, erosion of marginal pricing power. The longer you sit in that chair, the less valuable you become, unless you change the way you do things. And so younger generation quite correctly recognizing that traditional values, traditional way of progression or professions or training will no longer yield the type of results that the previous generations would have experienced. And so they are trying to find an alternative way. And that's why I usually compare them much more to generation of sort of during the World War II, in other words, pre-baby boomers. They want much more of a community spirit. They want greater reliance on the government and the state. Basically, the state becomes one of those guardrails protecting them against the whirlwind of change, against massive disruption that they're facing. Just look at ChatGPT. It's almost guaranteed within 5 years, any white-collar employee will face almost a death valley. So in other words, what they're going to do will be so drastically different to anything they would have done. Now, it doesn't mean that the job disappears, but what it does mean that if investment bank was recruiting, call it 100 graduates, in order to whittle it down to maybe 20 who will survive, now they will only recruit 50, and maybe only 2 will be needed at the end of this process. So what you do, how you do it, and ChatGPT is just one part. The other part of it, of course, is anything to do with quantum computing, anything to do with machine learning, anything to do with 3D printing. It starts spreading that evolution much, much wider. And so if we were sitting here 10, 15 years from now, the definition of labor, what does labor actually do? The definition of productivity, what is meant by productivity, the definition of what capital does, I think will be very significantly different.
Victor,
So
are you saying
that's why
that
it explains
snowflakes and
why younger
millennials,
generation behaves differently.
are you implying that snowflakes and millennials, like you're pushing this trope, they don't want to go work?
No, I don't think it is the case. I think Yuval Harari once correctly highlighted that the essence of, in the context of universal basic income guarantee, the essence of UBI is not to make people lazy, but to compensate for their irrelevancy. And that's the essence of it. It's not laziness that is driving, for example, UBI. It is a fact that humans are becoming progressively less valuable. And as I said, it shifts from profession to profession. It shifts from service to service. But eventually, and a lot of people say, hey, you know what? We used to have a buggy driver who became a truck driver. And that's true. There used to be an agricultural guy, a peasant, who became a factory worker. And then it became a different factory worker. Isn't it going to go exactly the same way that we will find alternative ways of doing it? Now, whenever I think about it, I always reminded of Kevin Drum comments. He said, look at the upheaval that industrial revolutions have done, and all it did, it complemented muscle power. Could you imagine what replacing cognition is going to do? And so to me, it's not a snowflake. It's not that they're lazy. It is a perception which is accurate, that you need to understand that the conventional progression paths, conventional professions, conventional way of making money or generating income is not going to work. So one of the things Lara Tyson was describing, which is I also think is very accurate. What will happen 10 years from now if technology reaches a stage that even the highly educated people will find that they cannot deploy their labor at a socially acceptable rate, at a rate of income that will provide them with the sorts of welfare or other means to actually have a decent lifestyle. And that is true. That's a core. What will happen if we reach that stage?
So your point.
You don't want me to ask where the money is going to come from to pay for the UBI. Like, doesn't someone have to go and work, and or you believe in MMT?
Yeah, well, I do. In a sense, basically, my argument has always been if I could go to not neoliberal, but liberal world, the way I experienced it back in 1980s, if I could go back, I would do that. But the problem is there is no time machine to take me back. The only thing we can do is to move forward. And as you start thinking about moving forward, what I describe in the book as Fujiwara effect, which is merge of two hurricanes. One is a financialization that we have done over the last 30 or 40 years, where we completely decoupled money supply and credit from underlying economic activity. And the other one, information age, which is a technological progression. That's sort of a merge of those two hurricanes. Is displacing everything, is displacing the role of labor, is displacing usefulness of labor, is displacing how capital works. When people say, how are we going to pay? My goodness, how did we pay for everything else? If you think of the United States, for example, for the last 40 years, money supply grew 2 or 3 times faster than nominal GDP consistently. Now, what's the difference between those two lines? The difference between those two lines are assets. This is your 401ks, this is your pensions, this is your houses. If you ever try to bring those two lines together, the social and political consequences of that will be totally unacceptable. And that's part of the reason why I even support central banks. One of the things I've argued that over the last 4 years, Federal Reserve might have done a perfect job. Going into COVID, they ensured that we don't have a deflationary bust. Coming out of COVID, they're ensuring we don't have a deflationary bust. And if inflation comes off, which I'm saying it would as we progress forward, then it's almost a perfect job. You've achieved all of that in those 4 years without causing massive dislocation, either economically or in terms of asset prices. So I accept that it is inevitable that financialization cannot be unwound.
Before we go,
I accept that it's
one more thing
inevitable.
before we go on, just with you and Michael. Did you say that people are becoming more or less skillful, that their skills are broadening or they're narrowing? I mean, I think that today we need more narrow skills, more specialization is what's required in today's economy. But you just said the opposite, or did I hear it wrong?
I do. No, you've heard correctly. One of the things I discussed in the book is that our educational system is still structured on industrial age lines, that gradually you increase the degree of specialization required. What we should do is to restructure it backwards. In a sense, bachelor's degrees should disappear altogether. The only people completing bachelor degrees should be the people who pursue some kind of academic career. What you should have is the very rapid succession of certificates and training done in various areas where you can change from culinary classes to IT, from paintings to virtual media to coding to anything else you want to do. So the pressure over the next 10 years will be to broaden the skills, not to narrow. But today's educational system is actually continued to be designed to narrow it. Sorry. I don't know why my. I don't know why.
It's okay, Victor. We'll get a technology specialist over to help you out.
His specialized skill of Zoom has been kind of broadened. So.
That's right. And think how we're broadening our skills in many other ways. You know, when I was a younger man, you used to have a secretary. Today, you're your own secretary. Yeah. Now, you can do it almost as good as a secretary did, but what you're doing, secretary cannot do. So you can see how the skills are widening, and they will continue. They will have to continue doing so.
So this is actually, I want to show a couple of slides that I had shared with Victor and the rest of the team that hit on some of these components, right? And so let me very quickly share this screen. Okay, so the first slide I'm showing here, this is showing the slide that we're all very familiar with, the declining value of the dollar on the left-hand side. And I'm actually highlighting, importantly, the multiple revisions of CPI, right? So we've changed the baskets, we've changed the way that we think about inflation. And in each of those, we've actually managed to continue to see a falling value of the US dollar. Now, the reason that I find this so interesting is the chart on the right, which is the share of household expenditures. So if I see the value of the dollar falling, theoretically, I would expect that I'm going to see the value of apparel or clothing or a fine men's suit rising over time. And yet, over the course of this same chart that shows the value of the dollar collapsing, the amount of money that an average household spends on clothing has fallen from 14% of the household budget to today. That number sits at 2.6%. And by the way, so this is drawn from a BLS study that dates back to 2006. When I originally looked at this data set, I only had available through 2003. Just for the heck of it, I actually ran a forecast using a logarithmic forecast on this level. It actually came out and said that by 2021, we would expect it to be 2.9%. And the actual answer in 2021, after inflation of 10% drove apparel prices up relative to incomes, was that it was at 2.6%. So we're actually falling faster. If I extend this out using the exact same technique, it suggests that by 2050, we'll actually be looking at clothing being totally free.
Or you'll be naked.
What's that?
Or you'll be naked.
Well, we could return to the trees, and Harley is quite a bit hairier than I am, so he'll be better covered. But it's that's not an image anyone really wants for either of us. But this is actually, and by the way, if you extend it further, and I'm going to laugh as I say this, right? The next step is you get paid to wear clothes, right? Those who want to advertise their wares begin paying people to wear their clothes. It's already happening with the influencers, et cetera, right? So there's a very real component to what Viktor is highlighting. Now, the fly in the ointment so far has been the relative productivity. The reason we see the falling value of the dollar has been the relative productivity of goods versus services, right? So while goods have declined in value significantly or fallen as a share of our purchasing basket, services have exploded. And I actually was just walking somebody else through this chart, but I'm going to flip over to another screen here just to show this quickly here. This is looking at the consumption of, I'm going to pull this up here, I apologize. This is looking at the consumption of goods per capita in the United States since 1959 and services per capita since 1959. And the astonishing thing here is that what you discover is that the consumption of goods per capita has grown by about 450% over that whole time period. In other words, we have 4.5 times as many clothes, refrigerators, cars, et cetera, on a per capita basis than we would have had in the 1950s. Right, a chicken in every pot has now become 4.5 chickens in every 4.5 pots that we each have. On the flip side of that, we've seen services consumption, right? The consumption of services per capita rise not 4.5 times over that time period, but 43 times over that time period, right? In other words, what we consume has increasingly become a function of the services economy. And that services economy fails under the rubric that Viktor has been highlighting, right? Because it doesn't have the same productivity characteristics. Right now, the crazy component that is actually introduced here, the reason we were able to do this on the good side is automation, mechanization, robots, et cetera. We call all those things productivity enhancing capital investments that have taken our capacity from producing a bushel of corn in 1850 to our capacity to make delicious Twinkies complete with high fructose corn syrup in the 1990s to today. We now have organic Twinkies that have food that is healthy for you and prevents cancer, right? Now, it's obviously an overstatement, but it would give you an idea of the sort of productivity enhancements that we've experienced. The really interesting question for me is, does AI represent that fundamental break that suddenly turns services into traded goods? And so they no longer suffer from things like Balmer's disease, where ultimately I can't access that labor unless I'm willing to pay the higher price for it.
Yeah.
What's your, is that consistent with how you were thinking about this, Viktor?
Yes, it is. The way I basically describe it is everything is going to zero. So no matter what it is going to be zero. And in fact, in most cases, as you highlighted, you will be paid in various forms It doesn't have to be money, but you will be paid to consume a lot of those things. So in other words, the cost will actually be below zero. And what you're seeing is that on the good side, there are further productivity gains to be made. So if you think of new factories, think of the United States. Manufacturing output in the US for about 20 years until 2008 was only growing about 1%. Now, that meant against global growth rates of 3.5%, 4%, that the US was consistently losing global market share. Over the last decade or so, US manufacturing output started to grow at more like 3.5%. So US started to match global numbers. So US no longer is losing relative market share. So that's a true manufacturing revolution is occurring. But then if you look at investments and if you look at employment, you don't see that. In a sense that if you think of non-residential private fixed asset investment in the US, today, roughly 55% is going into technology, IT, software, intangibles. So overall, companies in the US investing the same amount of money as they did in the 70s. They're roughly investing 13, 14% of GDP. But only around 40% goes into real hard assets, the buildings, the machinery, and the rest of it. And that's why most people don't see it. And they say companies in the US are underinvesting, but they are not. They're just investing into the future. So what that implies is that it's still very hard to establish manufacturing in the US. There are many rules, there's too many problems. But as soon as you've established that, there is really no need for fixed assets and there is no need for employment. That's why manufacturing employment in that period dropped from 10% of the labor force to 8%. And so you can see how manufacturing itself will keep on driving the cost. As you correctly said, services are not that because services are contingent on humans, as you described them. Could chat GDP and other technologies, right. GPT is not going to be the end of it. A lot of people say, well, it doesn't have the neurons of human brain, but that's not the point. The point is we don't need to replicate human brain. We just need them to be very, very good in a very selected niches. And that's what they're going to be. Could that then start disintermediating the services? So in other words, what people in Omaha and Ohio and Michigan have experienced through 1980s and 1990s, is it coming to the East Coast and the West Coast in the service area? The answer is yes. And so ultimately, the productivity will mushroom. The way I basically look at it, prior to the first industrial revolution, productivity growth rates were very slow. They were about 10 bips per annum, if you're lucky. And that's why, Michael, you correctly said that if you look at 1500s, early 1700s, there was not a huge amount of difference. At the end of the first industrial revolution, call it 1850s, 1860s, productivity was more like 100 basis points, or almost 100 basis points. By the time we go into 50s and 70s, it was more like 2%. And so now productivity is down. And productivity is down because when you're in the middle of revolution, productivity goes down, not up. Because what you're doing, you're dislocating too many variables in the economy, and the economy needs to adjust. And that takes about 2 generations. So you're looking at 50, 70 years, usually, for productivity to mushroom. And if you put your criteria being early 1980s or mid-1980s as a beginning, that puts you sometime into 2030s or 2040s. When a productivity won't just go from 50 bips to 100, 150 bips, it's got to go to 500 bips very easily. And at that
sorry. Mike and I, you may not know this, have had a small disagreement about inflation. He's still not right yet, but there's time. You're right. We're going to 2030. Then I guess transitory could go that far also. The last chart he showed kind of supports my thinking that the reason why we have inflation and it's not going below 4% anytime soon is that it's more service driven. And with the boomers retiring and lack of immigration, we have this chokehold on labor and the demand for services. How do you square that concept with your idea that we're going to go into, if not disinflation, deflation?
Yeah, I actually tend to push back on all of those arguments in a sense that First of all, I don't agree with running out of labor. I usually say to people, look, did you think we're running out of labor on the 1st of January 2020? Did you think we were running out of commodities or goods on the 1st of January 2020? The answer was no. What happened in the last 3 years? Well, people say, well, it's because we've stimulated the economy too much. Now, the reality is aggregate demand in the US now is only about 100 basis points higher than it would have been without COVID. If you think of UK, Eurozone, Japan, and certainly China, they're well below this trajectory. So globally, you can't argue that we have excess demand. So that's my first point. I don't believe there is excess demand. And the only country where it exists, it's gradually coming off. In other words, the goods are normalizing, the services are normalizing, real deposits are coming back to trajectory. So I don't believe we are running out of people. The second thing I tend to highlight is that we're actually not measuring people properly. And that's one of the things I keep highlighting in my notes, that if we were measuring people properly, the proportion of labor force in the US in multiple jobs will not be 4.5%, 5%. Because remember, it stayed at around 5% for 2 decades. I can't believe that we only have 7.5, 8 million people who are reputedly only working more than one job. Secondly, we should see a lot more self-employed people. Again, self-employment as a percentage of labor force remained flat at 10% for 2 decades. Thirdly, we should see more hours. Hours are stuck between 34.5 and 35 hours for God knows how long. So to me, BLS is not capturing the changing labor force, particularly in the US and UK, less so in other countries. And the reason for that is simple, that in the US, government does not support employment. It supports either corporates or it supports people, but not the employment. So if you were in Germany, a bartender in January 2020, or if you're in Sydney, Australia, a bartender in January 2020, you're still bartender today. What happened in the US and to a lesser extent UK, you were thrown out into the street very quickly. And so the question is, what did you do with your free time? And the answer is, given flexibility of the US labor market, given very large gray economy, which could be as high as $3 to $4 trillion at least, you found alternative ways of piecing revenue together, stitching it together, which doesn't correspond to employment. You do a little bit of Amazon, you do a little bit of NFT trading, you do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So the good news in that is that I think we're grossly understating the income in the country. The bad news, we're overstating extent of labor pressures. So in other words, labor participation is higher, employment is higher, hours of work much higher, and hours, dollars per hour are much, much lower. So when a restaurant owner says, look, I want you as a guy I just sacked 2 years ago, come back and be a bartender. This bartender will say, hey, I'm doing other things. If you want me, you need to pay me 20% more. So BLS is not capturing the difference in income between what he does today and a new bartender wages. All they're capturing is a higher bartender wages. So that's the second thing. I think there is a lot more people, there is a lot more employment occurring than what the numbers suggest. The third area is, yes, legal immigration is down, but illegally over the last sort of 18 months, 5 million people crossed the border, a couple of million already disappeared. So if you live in places like Australia or Singapore or New Zealand, which are contained, have extremely harsh immigration policy, has no illegal immigration, they do have a major problem because they shut down the country like for 2 years. Australia alone will miss 600,000-800,000 people. So those sorts of countries have a choice. Either you become Japan and start deploying a lot of labor replacement, or you open up your borders. That's why the last couple of months in Australia was the highest immigration ever into Australia. They basically open up the borders. So I don't buy that argument either. In terms of the services, I accept that services are stickier and services tend to be much more difficult to bring the cost down. But that's where you start heading into much more greater deployment of technology as we go forward. That's going to start reducing those numbers. So to me, when I look at it, I basically say we have strong disinflationary pressures, technology that we discussed, financialization, which is indebtedness that we have, reliance on asset prices, demographics, inequalities. Because a lot of people say baby boomers are retiring. If they're retiring, they'll be spending money. That means neutral rates should go up. But the problem is people who have money these days are actually accumulating money faster than their capacity to spend. Because if you think of the United States, top 10% of households control over 70% of national wealth. Top 1% control about 35%. That very much corresponds to the age groups. They tend to be the older people. So that they're accumulating assets faster than their capacity to either consume or to provide for their retirement. Now, that actually is disinflationary rather than inflationary the way it normally would be if income and wealth distribution was much more even compared to what it is globally. So to me, whether I look at demographics, whether I look at inequalities, whether I look at labor market, I don't see what you've just
So
described.
when you're critiquing U.S. government policy of how we support businesses and other various things, you indicated, I think, in a prior discussion commentary that you think the way China is operating is a superior long-term process, and that over the course of time, the West would move towards a Chinese model, as opposed to China moving towards a U.S. model. Did I hear that correctly?
No, not quite. In a sense, the problem China has is that they fused private and public to an extent that there is really no room, no free room at all. So in other words, there is no light between public and private. Central banks in China, a central bank in China is not independent. Commercial banks are not really commercial, and there is really no private sector anymore. So when you fuse it to that extent, there is a question mark as to how you're going to grow. Now, so to me, the best answer, and that's the way I describe to my Chinese friends, is that it is true. Xi Jinping and the government in China connect very proactive. They connect very aggressively. If they identify the problem and say, this is a solution, they can do it tomorrow. If they identify this is what we don't want to happen, they can do it tomorrow. The way I describe it is that you cut somebody's head off, and if you made a mistake, you can glue it back on and say, you'll be okay. You'll be feeling okay. Give it a day or two, and you'll be fine. So the question to me is, the challenges we're facing in China and the US are not dissimilar. If you think of Biden discussing unaffordable housing, unaffordable healthcare, unaffordable education, should broadband be a human right rather than a private business? The role of social and digital platforms. Xi Jinping is discussing a lot of similar issues and trying to look at similar issues. The difference between the West and China is that in China, you can do things very quickly because there is no independent sources of power. There is no independent judiciary. There is no independent media. None of that exists. And the argument Chinese will say is that, yes, if we make a decision and it's a wrong one, we can unmake it within 24 hours. True. But what are the consequences of making a decision and then unmaking it so quickly? What does it do to ability to invest, ability to innovate, ability to invent? If you think of China, China's been the greatest innovative nation in the world over the last 40 years. But they invented absolutely nothing. That is the reason why both Donald Trump as well as Joe Biden can kneecap their technology industry as quickly as they're doing, because China completely reliant on the Western knowledge and on the Western science. Now, creating science is not about spending billions of dollars. It's about building on the shoulders of generations over a period of time. So the question that becomes, we're facing the same problems, solutions in both cases also the same. It basically more of the government.
Don't you require specialized skills to go and create technology, new ideas?
So, well, all I'm saying, the solutions are the same, are similar in a sense. United States and China underinvested massively in the basic research and fundamental research. Most of the research in both countries were applied research, not fundamental. Joe Biden is totally right to saying we've been living on the bank of research that was created in 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. We need to accelerate fundamental research. Only the government can do that. You know, Google doesn't do research, fundamental research, neither does Facebook. It's basically asking questions that you don't even know whether there is an answer. And when Xi Jinping is discussing accelerating fundamental research, he's correct, but only the government can do it. If you think of healthcare, education, housing, only the government can make a difference to those sectors. So solutions, in many ways, are the same. More of the government. The difference
you don't think Google or Microsoft have a Bell Labs type operation?
No, they don't.
Oh.
Even
By the way, my son works at Microsoft Research. Sorry.
Yeah, even the head of XLab, which is Google, said we do not do unidirectional research. So in other words, we don't do basic research. That is not done at Google. That can only be funded directly by the government. And the reason for that is very simple. It doesn't have commerciality to it. It doesn't have immediacy to it or a payoff to it. And bulk of fundamental research is wasted for the sake of finding one or two discoveries that actually could make a significant difference. So my answer is, in both cases, greater role for the government. The difference is a degree or the magnitude. Do you eliminate any free space between the government and the private enterprise? Do you eliminate any free space in educational institutions or labs? Do you preclude them from talking to people in other countries? Do you preclude them from exchanging information in other countries? So the difference to me is we're heading in the same direction, more of the government. What I'm hoping for is that in the West, we will find a solution which will still keep sufficient degree of freedom, both individual freedom, corporate freedom, innovative freedom, compared to what China is likely to have.
So one of the things that I want to share a couple more slides, because I think first, I also want to invite questions from the audience into the Q&A, because I can't believe that Viktor can say some of the things he's saying and not get a response. I know I personally want to jump through the screen on some of these, even as I agree very deeply with what Viktor is saying. In many ways, it feels incredibly frustrating to me, but it is also, unfortunately, very much in fitting with the fact pattern that we have. So a couple of slides that I wanted to show. One is actually looking at the dynamics of what drove the Industrial Revolution, what drove the expansion of trade. And this is actually, again, pulling from Joel Moker, the institutional origins of the Industrial Revolutions. He wrote a paper on this, and I encourage people to read it. It's really fascinating. But one of the things that he highlights is the expansion of trade outside of kinship circles, where effectively I would only trade with those who lived in my village or happened to be part of the Macallan clan, for example, into much broader organizations because of the creation of systems of trust that were created by things like the Bank of England, systems of credit, the ability to record data in double entry bookkeeping, et cetera. And one of the technologies that appears to be facilitating this dynamic of trust across regimes without requiring a central authority, right? In other words, allowing me to trade not just within the Green family, but also within the Bassman family, where candidly, I don't consider them particularly trustworthy, but yet would still choose to trade with them if I could achieve a degree of trust that Harley will follow through on his promises, which never happens usually, but we'll make an exception this time, is this idea of the decentralized blockchain, that this is effectively similar to a double entry bookkeeping, et cetera. Do you have any perspective on that observation?
Well, first of all, in terms of Joel Moker, I agree. It was a trust, and that trust had many layers. One of the layers was common law. Mm-hmm. The other layer was independent institutional pillars, whether it was a Bank of England, whether it was independent media. So gradually over time, all of those pillars were sort of grown and developed, and it enabled people at different parts of the world, at different parts of the country to trade, to interact. That in turn, as Douglas North always highlighted, reduces transaction costs. It basically reduces the friction. As you reduce the friction, cost comes down, there is more collaboration, and becomes greater affordability. The problem I have with a blockchain, at least the way it has developed in a cryptocurrency space, that most of the promises of independence, all of the promises of limited supply, all of those things never really come to pass. We always find how to multiply supply, no matter how limited it is. We always find that you will end up with certain people trying to oligopolize or monopolize, whether it's a supply of an instrument, whether it's transaction, whether it's mining. And so theoretically, it can work. My concern is that if you leave it to the private sector has a tendency towards monopolies. Private sector have a tendency of accumulating power if it is not checked in some form. And the only power capable of checking this tendency is a state. There is no other power capable of doing it. Now, neoliberals will argue morality or tradition or culture should be able to do it, but there's absolutely no evidence that either morality or culture in any culture actually manages to check that. And so the way I look at it, there is no alternative to the government standing behind all of that in order to ensure that there is sufficient degree of trust to transact. Either it's registering your documents or it's generating an alternative currency that needs to be accepted widely, or whatever that is. Only the government. The way I usually compare it to Bank of Amsterdam versus the Bank of Netherlands. Now, Bank of Amsterdam tried to create effectively a stable coin back in the 1500s and early 1600s. But human nature, big human nature, undermined that stable currency or stable coin. And it really took the Dutch government creating the Bank of Netherlands to resurrect that degree of stability. So to answer your question, you need to have institutional factors. But behind those institutional factors supporting it has to be state. Now, if society disagrees with that, then society is free to dismantle state. And in many historical episodes, that's exactly what happened. People dismantled the institutions that actually guaranteed that degree of trust. And as I always say, there is no point of arguing with people. If they made up their mind, you just need to wait for them to change their mind. There's no point of standing in front of the a tractor or something, because they're going to do what they're going to do. So hopefully that's the answer, and that's why I truly believe that only the state can reinforce this.
Victor, Victor, with all due respect, are you a modern day Walter Duranty? I mean, I don't quite get this thing over here about the state. I mean, it's not like I'm a nut job here, but I haven't seen this kind of government control work. I mean, reasonably anywhere. And when last time I checked, when the people went and stood in front of the tank, they got almost run over, in Tiananmen Square. I mean, I've never seen the people go and kind of vote to take back power without getting, put in the gulag.
Well, whenever people say freedom or the power, I always ask power to do what, and freedom from what. And people are always confused. Everybody wants freedom, but they're not quite sure what to do with it, and they're not quite sure why they need it. And so governments or states are a reflection of people. It's as simple as that. When people say that there is all sorts of problem in Washington and disorientation in Washington because American people are disoriented. When people say, how come in 1950s and 60s we could do great projects and we can't agree now? Because in 1950s and 60s people agreed. And that's why politics reflected it. And politics can never run ahead of the people. And so whenever you come to a stage that society is polarized and disoriented. And that happened in 1920s and 1930s. That also happened between, call it 1966, 67, all the way to early 1980s. And it is happening now. When society cannot agree on the structure of society, structure of the economy, then chaos rules because extremes take over. And extremes never give you the right answer, whether it's a total control by the state, which is, say, China, or whether it's complete freedom to do anything you want. So the population needs to agree. So if you think of pre-baby boomers, having suffered from a Great Depression, having suffered from World War II and many other things, clearly the parents of baby boomers have come to believe that the state represents the guardrail against violence that otherwise will engulf them, because they've seen that violence and they've seen what that violence can do. And so the conclusion was that we're prepared to trade our rights. We as people in the United States will trade some of our rights in for the government doing certain things. And so if you think of 50s and early 60s, that was not a liberal era by any stretch of imagination. And it was not a free era by any stretch of imagination. But what they were getting is the highways, the roads. They were getting suburbs. They're getting a college education, expansion of the educational system. They're getting massive basic R&D. Remember, basic R&D used to be the biggest chunk, apart from defense, what the federal government used to do back in 1950s and 1960s. Now, baby boomers who did not see the disruption, did not see those problems, basically wanted freedom. You know, I want to be free to marry anybody I want, to divorce anybody I want, to choose my job, to choose my country, to leave the country, to do whatever I want to do. And whether it was a Woodstock, whether it was smoking drugs, whether it was becoming an investment banker, it doesn't matter. It was the same argument. The argument was one of freedom. And so on the shoulders of baby boomers came Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Milton Friedman and the rest of it. Now we're paying the price for that freedom.
Okay,
and a price.
Clock's running down here. As we march towards this kind of Karl Marx utopia, what is the where should I be putting my money? This is an investment show. Not
Sure.
tomorrow, not 10 years, but like give me a 1 to 2 year horizon. What should I be? Where are the places that would be, you know, I'd make a profit on an investment?
Well, 1 or 2 years is very short term. So basically, what I've been arguing for.
I'll give you 5 years.
What I've been, if you think shorter term, what I've been arguing for a while that inflation is transitory. I never left the transitory camp. And the reason I never left the transitory camp, because transitory for me is not about the time it takes to bring inflation down, but rather about the tissue scarring of the labor market, the household sector, the corporate sector, the financial sector that it leaves behind. If there is no tissue scarring, then it is transitory, whether it takes a year or 2 or 3. And therefore, to me, it's much more comparable to inflation of 1919, 1921, and 1946, 48, 49, rather than 1970s. Now, if you take that view, then the answer is the only way we can boil the inflation or continue to boil the inflation is either we have to have a very expansionary fiscal policy, which we do not have right now and will not have until 25 at the earliest, or we have to have aggressive redistribution policy, which we do not have. Alternatively, we have to have a geopolitical and social blowups, which in my view are not going to happen over the next couple of years. Longer term it will, but not over the next couple of years. ESG and everything else, that's a longer term stuff. So to me, unless we spend fiscally and expand the fiscal deficit, or use the same deficits to redistribute the money, or unless we have black swans, whether it's pandemics, whether it's wars or geopolitics, inflation will fall off. Now, the question is how much it's going to fall off. And that comes back to your question of deflation. we have a strong disinflationary pressures, technology, financialization, debt, demographics, inequalities. But we also now have inflationary pressures that we did not have in 1990s, 2000s. Now, where do those inflationary pressures coming from? They essentially come from our response to the black swans, because we are now responding very aggressively through fiscal and monetary policies. And whatever we do, it causes a spike. But then if we stop doing it, that spike just comes off. And so my argument for the last 2 years was that normal distribution of outcomes is gone. So in other words, we now have extreme outcomes, or fat tails or black swans are too prevalent. In statistical terms, it basically means kurtosis is very high. When you have that, there is no average. So when people say, I think average inflation will be 4%, I guarantee they're wrong. Because inflation will be 6 and 0, but it won't be 4. So in other words, you won't have the ability to compute the average. As soon as you say normal distribution doesn't exist, then DCF is gone. Because what you're therefore dealing with is a world with very unstable neutral rates. Neutral rates could be up to 6% and down to 1% in the space of 12 months or less. If you have such instability of neutral rates, that means you have instability of risk-free rates. And because you have so many black swans, your ability to assess risk premium also diminishes. So it becomes a weird investable world in a sense that traditional normal distribution where you can assess the outcome, you could look back in history and say, over the last 30 or 40 years, this was the answer, can no longer be used. So how do you invest in that climate? Well, I identified 3 or 4 ways of investing. Number one, trade a lot. And people blame me saying, of course, you'll say that, you work for a bank. But if nobody knows which way is up or down, if nobody knows whether neutral rate is 6 or 1, if nobody knows what the benchmark should be, one way of dealing with that is to take the signals from the market. Market gives you signals every day. You just refuse to look at them, or you refuse to believe them, or you refuse to accept them, or you argue with them. Well, stop arguing. whatever the signals are, use them. And if you're a good trader, you could do 2 out of 3. So in other words, out of 3 moves you make, maybe 2 are going to be profitable. Now, that sort of investment is much more conducive to machines than humans, but I think that's one way of handling it. The other way of handling it, and the way I basically describe it, it's like, Cassie Wood approach. You nail your colors to the mast and you sail. And I don't care whether you are into nuclear bunkers, trees, and commodities, or whether you are into deflation and intangible assets, but be very clear what you want and very clear what you're all about. In a world of lack of clarity, clarity will be significantly rewarded. So more and more people will not be asking you how much money you're going to make me, but rather what do you stand for? And if you have a pedigree, you can adopt it. Now, if those 2 alternatives don't work, the third alternative that I recommend to everybody is what I call resilient portfolios. And what I mean by resilience, at the time of extreme uncertainty, high kurtosis, very unstable neutral rates and risk-free rates, you should always go with productivity and circular drivers. In other words, productivity drivers is basically whenever you think productivity will accelerate faster than the multiples that you're paying. And it doesn't really matter what industry it happens to be in. Circular drivers is your circular strengths. This is somewhat Cassie Wood approach in a sense. I have several things I like, things like replacement of humans, robotics, automation, artificial intelligence, augmentation of humans, which is a fusion of infotech and biotech. If humans becoming less relevant, that could be dangerous. So I have opium of the people. It's gambling, gaming, artificial reality. Because I'm a great believer that longer term social and polarization dislocation will continue to grow, I have part of the portfolio that we call bullets and prisons. In other words, buying into companies that offering products that actually participate or does some of that security and safety elements. There are areas like alternative transport energy platforms.
Victor, let me pause you for one second.
And then one more.
Yeah.
There are areas of commodities that I like.
Yeah.
And there are areas of capital goods companies that I like. They're not all commodities, but there are areas which look very, very attractive to me. And there are some capital goods related areas that do as well.
So the reason I wanted to pause you for a second is, let me just summarize very quickly. And I think it actually fits pretty well with what Harley believes, right? Which is, one, you're actually talking about, we don't know whether interest rates should be higher or lower, but we know that they should be different and variable. And so ultimately that would suggest that you want to buy some form of protection against much higher rates. Your base case would probably be that you want to bet on lower rates, right? So
that's right.
It would lead you to a position strongly favoring lower rates after a Fed hiking cycle, for example, but the potential for that to go much greater, right?
That's right.
People may be aware that there are some products that Harley has created that fit well with that underlying phenomenon. The second component that I would highlight is that you're effectively saying, look, the complaints that people made, if you really take yourself back to 1999 and you looked at the complaints that were made about Amazon, for example, it was, can you believe that Amazon is more richly valued than Barnes and Noble? Right? Now,
yes.
The answer, of course, was, well, absolutely it should have been, right? And so your point is that for all the hoopla and all the complaints about Cathie Wood, that she is in reality actually looking in the right area. She's looking at this disruptive technology.
She does.
We can disagree with everything she's saying. We can disagree with her choices, but it's a really, really important component. I want to take a few minutes, and we don't have much time.
But maybe, Michael, maybe one more thing I'll highlight, that what is regarded as disruptive changes over time.
Absolutely.
For example, if you think of a large digital platforms, my view, particularly consumer platforms, my view for a while was that they're sunsetting. They're gradually dying. And companies are the most profitable before they die. So what was working for the previous 15 years is not going to be the same. What's going to work for the next 15 years. So the nature of those circular drivers and the companies or assets that play into it changes. But please go ahead.
So let me just flip through a couple of quick things. One, we have a question from Kevin in the audience, or more of an observation, right? Which is that your line of thought is actually the exact opposite of the founders of the American Constitution, right? That if the founders of the American Constitution had actually believed what you're saying, that they would have created a far more restrictive and intrusive government. I'm going to push back actually against Kevin and highlight that the American founders initially tried that. They created the Articles of Confederation, which turned out to be a disaster because it did not give them the ability to influence things in the way that you're describing. One of the very first actions of the Washington administration was the suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion, which wanted to not pay taxes, right? So absolutely correct. The dynamics of Alexander Hamilton, I encourage people to go read the survey of manufacturers that he wrote in 1796, I think it was, right? Which highlights exactly this dynamic of state capacity, state planning, and how that led to the actual growth of America that we have. The story that most people hear is simply wrong. The second chart that I actually have had up for a while in the background is this dynamic of the stated dissatisfaction, right? And so one of the things that I would just highlight is, if I look at the actual surveys of workers' satisfaction with these jobs that we're so worried about them holding on to, they all hate them, right? 19% of the population in a 3.5% unemployment environment is labeled themselves as being miserable. 60% of the people are detached, right? So what you're actually describing is a situation in which we could offer a very tangible improvement over time. And I'm going to go quickly here. I apologize, right? If I look at the second dynamic that's going on, and I highlight this as no more teachers, no more books, right? We are actually on a global basis looking at a contraction of the population for those under the age of 24, 25 that is effectively here, right? We're no longer looking at growth in that population. That suggests a radical restructuring of many of the forms of services that we're discussing. And exactly as you're highlighting, a meaningful change in restructuring to the educational system. I'm going to keep going here for a second, right? How long has this been going on? You hit on the idea of ChatGPT and the criticisms that, hey, it's not perfect, it's not innovative, it doesn't create its own stuff, et cetera, right? These are all very similar to the complaints and observations that were made about technology in the past, because the reality is they weren't perfect, right? The simple reality is that a skilled artisan is typically going to be dramatically better than the initial crude attempts at automation, but that rapidly changes, right? So today, if you're extraordinarily rich, you may hire an Italian craftsman to sculpt marble for you. But the vast majority of the rest of us powder up marble and put it into a cast surface, and we couldn't care less. There's no difference between the two, right? Okay, let's see here. And oh, I lost. All right, so I wanted to do one last thing, and this is on the innovative part. And I know that Harley loves the music of the day. So this is something that actually I came across. Where is it? That's not it. Oh, that's what I wanted to go for. Let's go to this. So this is actually something that I was just exposed to by my friend Josh Wolf. And this goes to the dynamics of productivity in the services space. You may be familiar with ChatGPT, Harley, but have you heard of 11 Labs yet? Okay, so 11 Labs is an audio version, among other things. It's a multimedia version of ChatGPT. I know you're a huge fan of music. This is actually the result of having fed 11 Labs all the material, all the work of Jay-Z. All right, so the rapper. Oh, the slide's not showing. Hold on one sec here. I'll reshare it. And I encourage people to look at stuff like this, right? So this is actually not Jay-Z performing. This is an AI having been fed all of Jay-Z's material to create a Jay-Z-like outcome. And tell me if you can hear this. Can you guys hear this?
I cannot.
All right, hold on one sec. Okay, I'm gonna try this one more time.
Okay.
Can you hear it now?
No.
Oh, all right. We'll send this out. I apologize. People can see my screen. Search for Jay-Z versus generated by AI in YouTube. This is an extraordinary listen. It is one of these things that for me absolutely changed things significantly. So with that, Victor, this has been provocative. It's been thoughtful. Harley's head is hurting because, among other things, he's been told yet again he's going to be wrong on inflation, even if he's been right for a few months. I want to just say thank you very much, and I appreciate everyone jumping in with the questions. I'm looking at the last component. Jake Bookwalter, I'll answer your question on Twitter. Thank you so much. I appreciate you popping in. Eric, I'll let you lead this out.
Great. Thanks, guys. And thanks to everyone at home tuning in. Be sure to join us on May 4th as we host Ben Versher of Treasure Financial and Charlie McGarrett of Altus Partners to discuss the tools, techniques, and products used in modern treasury management. You won't want to miss it. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.